Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Welcome to a joint briefing of the House Environment and Transportation Committee and House Economic Matters Committee on the electrification impacts on the Maryland electric grid. We recently received from the Public Service Commission a study that the General Assembly requested in the Climate Solutions Now Act about electrification of our economy and the grid's ability to handle it. And obviously, this is an issue of paramount importance to meeting our ambitious state environmental goals. So really important briefing today with members of the Public Service Commission and their consultants who assisted them. And speaking of members of the Public Service Commission, have to shout out all the members are important, but our favorite member, former chair of the Environment and Transportation Committee,
hey guys, great
Commissioner Barbe, thank you for joining. Chair Wilson, any opening comments?
Thank you, Chair. Just as for all the colleagues, just obviously, I would ask that we hold our questions until the end of the not presentation, but at least the presenter. Give them a chance because some of the times, some of the questions we have will be answered if we allow them to continue. So, of course, it's important everybody's camera's on. Please stay on as long as you can. I want to make this, as brief as I can, but as important as it is, I want to make sure that we give these folks the time that they need to thoroughly discuss this issue. So please save your questions to the end of each of the presenters, and then we'll move from there. All right, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. And I should also mention for the ENT committee members, at least the full study should be in your inbox or a link to it, so you can look at that, which might answer some of your questions as well. Joining us this morning, and of course, in addition to Commissioner Barbe, is Fred Hoover, Chair of the Public Service Commission, John Borkowski, Senior Commission Advisor, Dr. Senem Sergici, and I apologize for butchering the names, from the Brattle Group, Akhilesh Ramakrishnan, Senior Associate at the Battle Group, and again, Commissioner Barbe. So with that, let me turn it over to Chair Hoover to get us rolling.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Wilson and Chair Corman and the members of the Economic Matters Committee and the Environment and Transportation Committee. As you know, the Climate Solutions Now Act required that the Public Service Commission complete a study of the gas and electric companies' ability to and capacity to provide for the electric distribution system successfully under a managed transition to a highly electrified building sector. And so the Public Service Commission created a work group, a broad work group of a number of stakeholders, both from the industry, government agencies, and public interest groups, chaired by John Borkowski, the commission engineer. That work group designed an RFP, which led to the hiring of the Brattle Group, a national organization that has conducted a number of studies around the country on this subject and has also done work previously in the state of Maryland. And so with that, I will turn this presentation over to John Borkowski to introduce the Brattle folks and report the results of the study.
Okay, thank you, Chair Hoover, and good morning, Chairs Wilson and Corman, and to the members of the Economic Matters and Environment and Transportation Committee who are here today. As was mentioned, I am a Senior Commission Advisor for the PSC, and I was the work group leader for the study. With me here today, besides Chair Hoover and Commissioner Barbe, we have Kathy Fuston, who's our Deputy Director of Legislative Affairs and Communications, and she will be helping with some of the Q&A in the end if needed. From Brattle, we have, and by the way, I can't see slides that are up. Are slides being put up? Or am I to? Okay, thank you. From Brattle, we have Dr. Senem Sergici, and Senem is a Brattle principal and also was the Brattle project lead for the study. And Akhilesh Ramakrishnan, he's a senior associate at Brattle, and he was responsible for managing the study for Brattle. Next slide, please. Okay, just a brief introduction, again, for our commissioners, for those who do not know them all. We have 5 commissioners here at the PSC, including a chair, Chair Hoover, who oversees the agency, and the commissioners, of course, are appointed by the governor for staggered 5-year terms and approved by the state Senate. Chair Hoover and Commissioner Richard are former directors of the Maryland Energy Administration. And Commissioner O'Donnell, who's not on with us today, but he served 22 years in the House of Delegates, and Commissioner Barbe served 32 years in the House of Delegates, including several as past chairman of the Environment and Transportation Committee. Next slide, please. Okay, now regarding the study was required by the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, which directed the PSC to conduct a study to assess the capacity of each company's gas and electric distribution systems to serve customers under a managed transition to a highly electrified building sector. And I won't go through all these, but the study requirements required us to look at peak demand through 2031, compare future demand growth to historic rates, consider grid capacity to serve this projected electric growth in the future due to electrification, and also assess shifts in seasonal gas and electric loads. Next slide, please. Okay, Chair Hoover already has mentioned some of the details about the work group, so I'm going to skip a lot that's on here. But we did have a work group to assist with the study, including helping us develop the RFP, which led to the successful engagement of the Brattle Group. And Brattle has independence and credibility in the industry. They're widely recognized for delivering objective and data-driven analyses. They also, as a matter of interest, performed the DC electrification study. And Brattle's familiarity with Maryland energy policy matters and utility planning initiatives through prior engagements really allowed them to conduct this study efficiently and with a nuanced understanding of Maryland issues. And the Brattle Group worked with our electrification study work group stakeholders to deliver an objective, independent, and transparent study, which was completed last month. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over on the next slide to Sinem and Akhilesh to review the study results.
Thank you so much, John. Good morning, chairs, commissioners, and members of the Economic Matters Committee and Environment and Transportation Committee. It's our pleasure today to be presenting the results of the electrification study. As John mentioned, this study has been in progress over the course of the past 7 months, and we've been diligently working on delivering this robust study with support from the electrification working group. So our plan for today is, maybe we could move to the next slide. We have 3 main agenda items. So again, we'll do an introduction to what our scope is and what our scope wasn't. We will talk about customer adoption of decarbonization technologies that we modeled in the study, and we will present the results of the study. And we have budgeted for a good amount of time at the end to answer your questions about the study. The next slide, please. The next slide. So we will, as John mentioned, so this study was to understand the impact of a managed transition to a highly electrified future, but most specifically building and transportation future. So what we've done is, for each in-scope utility system, we undertook a very detailed modeling of electric load, including hourly load impacts by end use and appliance type for transportation and building sectors through 2031. And we started this modeling effort by representing the mix of end users and equipment penetration that exists today, based on the best available data and using the existing Maryland studies to make sure that we are consistent across different Maryland studies studying the same decarbonization related issues. And when it comes to representing these mix of end users and equipments, we represented things like distributed energy resources, distributed solar, storage, energy efficiency, load flexibility programs, electric vehicles, heat pumps, hot water heaters. So they were all in our modeling effort and represented, again, for the reference case, as well as they were projected based on each of the scenarios that we studied. We relied on Empower GHG abatement study, which was completed last year, PPRP 100% RPS study, and MDE 60/31 study to, again, align our assumptions and benchmark our results to those studies so that there were consistency across all Maryland studies. So we have also analyzed historical electric and gas demand trends for each in-scope utility, because remember, our goal is to project what the future growth rates are going to look like under these highly electrified future scenarios and compare them to the historical trends to see if we are seeing any very different trends compared to the past. That's what we're trying to figure out. Or should we be really worried about what we're seeing in terms of projections, or has something like that happened in the past that we can take comfort in having managed it in the past, that we could also manage it in the future? So that's essentially what the study is trying to get at. So we analyze the historical trends, and now what we have done is, with the help of the working group, we defined 6 study scenarios ranging from representing lower levels of electrification, mid levels of electrification, and really high levels of electrification. And we have quantified the incremental electrification impact in these scenarios relative to what's already included in utility baseline forecasts. And we have worked with utilities' 10-year plans and their forecasts in these 10-year plans to, again, use as our starting point as we start to build the elements of electrification. And after modeling the electrification impacts, we have also tracked reductions in the consumption of natural gas and other fossil fuels, because as we electrify heating, that means that there's going to be a corresponding decrease in the use of fossil fuels. So we've tracked those reductions as electrification takes off. And we have also tracked the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions due to the reductions in this fuel demand. And while we were doing this modeling, we have taken into account some of the load mitigation measures, such as energy efficiency and load flexibility. So with the help of energy efficiency and demand response and many charging programs and many others that we modeled in the study, we are able to mitigate the pace of load growth that we projected in the study. So this was at a high level what was in the scope of the study. Could move to the next slide. As much as it is important to understand what is in the scope of the study, it is also very important to understand and discuss what was not in the scope of this study. So let's just take a minute to go over that. So cost of each of these scenarios and mitigation options were not in the scope of study. So we didn't really engage in trying to quantify what it would cost to the ratepayers to undertake each of these scenarios. We did not provide recommendations on specific utility distribution and delivery investment plans. We didn't engage in answering questions and modeling efforts pertaining to the future of gas delivery systems. We didn't opine on regulatory and business models for electric and gas utilities in this highly electrified future. We did not model the impact on electric and gas systems beyond 2031 because CSNA has asked the study to go through 2031. So we ended our study there. And we have also not done an economy-wide emission modeling, but instead we benchmarked our building sector emissions to what's implied by Maryland Climate Pathway Study, and it's meeting its 60 by 31 target. So we essentially, after producing our emissions impact, we benchmarked to what they said was necessary for the building sector to reduce their emissions by, and we've essentially confirmed that our high electrification scenarios meet those goals. So this is essentially, again, what we did not aim to answer with this current study that we undertook. Okay, so let me turn this over to my colleague Akhilesh Ramakrishnan. So he's going to walk us through the scenarios that we modeled, as well as the technology assumptions that we developed. And then after that, I'll jump back again and discuss the results from the study.
Thank you, Sanam. And good morning to the chairs and members of the two committees. So as Sanam said, I'm going to walk through kind of the setup of the study, how we set up these 6 scenarios that we modeled and what the assumptions were within each of those scenarios. So what this table is showing is basically the definition of the 6 scenarios that we, along with the working group, came up with as the framework for this study. So in this table, there are 6 columns. Each of the columns refers to one scenario. And the scenarios are basically split up into 3 sets of scenarios. The first 2 scenarios are kind of quote unquote business as usual, where it's not really focused on the decarbonization goals. The first scenario, the reference scenario, is kind of our baseline for this study. It's just looking at what if things were as they are defined in the utilities load forecast today, which is not assuming kind of a paradigm shift in terms of large-scale electrification of buildings or transportation or distributed energy resources. So that's pretty much business as usual. And then we have a low and mid electrification scenario where electrification happens, but to a very limited extent. And then we have the last 3 scenarios, which are high electrification scenarios, which are really the focus of our presentation today. Those 3 high electrification scenarios differ in terms of the main kind of prevalent technology used to electrify the building sector. So in that hybrid set of solutions, hybrid basically refers to keeping the fossil fuel system going, maintaining kind of the existing system and using it as backup for electrified technologies. So that's the high electrification with fuel backup scenario. Then in the pursuit of policy goals through direct emission reduction solutions, those are the 2 high electrification scenarios, which are kind of full electrification. So in those 2 scenarios, the building sector is decarbonized using highly efficient heat pumps in the first case, or through less efficient heat pumps in the second scenario. So those are our 3 high electrification scenarios. And then in terms of outside the building sector, we modeled distributed energy resources within all of these scenarios as meeting the renewable portfolio standard. So that's something that doesn't differ across scenarios, but it is modeled within all of the scenarios. And for transportation, it kind of follows those scenario definitions, where in the high electrification scenarios, transportation is also electrified, consistent with the regulations that have been adopted by the state. And then in the reference and low electrification scenarios, there's much more limited transportation electrification. And then finally, for demand-side management, which refers to energy efficiency and load flexibility programs deployed by the utilities, under each of the 6 scenarios, we look at 2 different levels of demand-side management. One is if there were only existing or mandated programs that are carried forward through 2031. And 2 is an additional set of demand response programs. So that includes kind of expansion of existing programs as well as new programs using new technologies. So next slide. So as I said, only 3 of the scenarios actually meet the decarbonization goals but for 2031, which is 60% reduction by 2031. So the rest of this presentation and kind of the focus of the results we're going to present focus on those 3 high electrification scenarios, which are really what was kind of laid out in the CSNA as the requirement for this study. And so this slide, we're focusing on what the key difference is between those 3 high electrification scenarios that we're going to focus on. And so in the first scenario, which is the electrification with fuel backup case, the prevalent type of equipment that's used by customers to decarbonize their heating is a heat pump with fossil fuel backup. So what that means is customers that currently heat using fossil fuels either maintain and keep maintaining and repairing their equipment and keeping it around, or they replace it with new fossil fuel equipment, even after they adopt a heat pump. So the way these customers operate is they use their heat pump down to a certain low temperature, it could be 20, 25 degrees. And then for any temperature below that, so in the coldest hours of the year, they switch to using their fossil fuel equipment. So the benefit of this kind of use case is that the fossil fuel equipment is going to take all of the load and kind of the highest heating demand hours of the year. So that's going to minimize electricity demand impacts. In the middle scenario, the electrification with best-in-class technologies, most customers are assumed to adopt the most efficient forms of heat pumps. So that's cold climate heat pumps, cold climate air source heat pumps, and ground source heat pumps. So these are the technologies that already exist today. They're very efficient. So even at those very low temperatures, the heat pumps are going to be relatively low electricity demand. And that's really the benefit of this case. So these are kind of newer types of equipment. They exist today, but they're a bit more expensive, and they're going to get better over time. And then finally, there's the electrification with legacy technologies scenario where customers are also still decarbonizing using air source heat pumps, but the type of air source heat pump is less efficient. They're kind of, older models of heat pumps, which are pretty common today, and they need electric resistance backup to supplement the heat. So kind of the advantage of this scenario for customers is that these types of heat pumps are very common and they're cheaper than the newer models of heat pumps. But the disadvantage is that when that resistive heating kicks in to supplement the heat pump at low temperatures, that's the type of heating that's going to have the highest electricity demand. So in the coldest hours of the year, the resistive heating is going to kick in. Customers are going to have really high demand. And so this is going to be kind of the worst case scenario in terms of the electricity load impact results. Next slide. So here we're going to walk through kind of the specifics of the penetration levels for different technologies assumed in each scenario. Next slide. So I'll spend probably the most time on this slide and then walk through the rest pretty quickly. This slide is the one that talks about the heating equipment penetration assumptions. And what we're looking at on the left is how sales are assumed to change over time. So sales are referring to new sales in each year. So the way we kind of set up this modeling is when customers, so we start with the existing kind of mix of heating equipment that customers have in each utility territory. So for example, that 43% in the first bar refers to natural gas equipment penetration, where so 43% of homes in Maryland currently use natural gas to heat. In the reference case, we assume that stays flat. So it's still 43% by 2031, pretty much nothing changes. In the other 3 scenarios, all of those fossil fuel heated customers today switch over to different forms of electric heat. So sales can change more quickly because in the next year, if there was some regulation or incentive to get customers to buy more electric equipment, that can change pretty quickly, but only a small portion of customers are actually in the market each year. So that takes time to flow through to the chart on the right, which is installed stock of equipment. So from the left, you can see what we've modeled is kind of a 100% shift over to almost 100% shift over to electric technologies by 2031. And the difference between the three scenarios is just what type of electric technology. On the right, you can see that that change in new sales takes a long time to flow through to the stock. So by 2031, over 30% of customers still have their old fossil fuel equipment because they just haven't been in the market yet to buy new equipment. Aside from that, the main thing here is you can see kind of the different penetration of the electric heating technologies. In the fuel backup case, as the name suggests, the air source heat pump plus fuel is the prevalent technology with 32% of sales. In the other two cases, heat pumps or air source heat pumps are more prevalent with 82% sales of cold climate heat pumps and then 57% of air source heat pump plus resistance in the legacy technology case. Next slide. So I won't spend much time here. It's just kind of a similar slide, but just for the commercial sector, the kind of mix of starting and ending penetrations are very similar to what's happening in the residential sector. Next slide. So here we're looking at a similar set of slides for transportation. The transportation kind of electrification policies already exist. There are two sets of policies, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, which applies to light duty vehicles, which is the first bar shown. It requires about 76% of new sales to be electric or zero emission by 2031. And that flows over to kind of the vehicles on the road, with 23% of vehicles being electric by 2031 if we hit those sales targets. Similarly, there's a regulation for trucks, the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, which kind of varies by vehicle class, but somewhere between 35 and 55% of sales are required to be electric by 2031. And that has a pretty modest impact on the stock by 2031, which reaches 8 to 13% electric vehicles on the road. Next slide. And then for distributed energy resources, so that's solar and storage on customer property, kind of what we call behind the meter. These two are dictated by the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So basically, we pull these numbers from the other parallel study, the PPRP-RPS study, which shows that to meet the RPS, behind the meter solar capacity would grow from around 1,200 megawatts today to almost 2,300 megawatts by 2031. And then for storage, it's growing from about 40 megawatts today to about 500 megawatts by 2031. Next slide. And then for the DSM programs, here we're looking at energy efficiency, utility energy efficiency programs, where, as I kind of laid out in the scenario matrix slide, we're looking at two sets of cases for within each scenario. So the first case is a case where only the existing or mandated programs are carried through 2031. And so here, what the utility plans are showing is about 8,000 gigawatt hours of electricity savings by 2031. And so this is just with mandated programs being carried through 2031. Then in the additional case, which we've defined based on what is called the maximum achievable scenario in the Empower proceeding, which is basically a case where only cost-effective programs are deployed, but all cost-effective programs are deployed, regardless of budget. In that case, you get about 18% more energy efficiency for about 9,700 gigawatt hours of savings. Next slide. And finally, for the load flexibility assumptions, we modeled a set of programs based on kind of our experience working across the US in different jurisdictions, looking at kind of really effective programs deployed by other utilities and up-and-coming programs that are going to capture some of the, use some of the technologies that we're modeling in this study. For the existing case, we're just modeling, utilities' kind of current participation in these programs. If they don't have some of these programs, we don't model them. And then in the additional DSM case, we model all of these programs with kind of a modest level of adoption that we think is ambitious but achievable in this time frame based on kind of our experience from different jurisdictions. So the set of programs we're looking at here is going to be things like dynamic rates, where the electric rate varies through the day, and that causes customers to kind of shift their behavior a little bit. And also kind of active management programs like managed EV charging or battery demand response, where the utility can control some of the customer equipment by kind of sending it signals during the peak hours. So, for example, managed EV charging would mean EV charging is shifted out of the peak hours into the off-peak hours to kind of ease electric load in those hours. So with that, let me pass it back to Sanam to go through the results of all of these scenarios.
Thanks, Akhilesh. So I'm going to try and cover the results in the next 10 minutes, so we can have 20 minutes for a discussion of the results. The next slide, please. So what does this all mean for the projected peak load? So this is a very packed graph. So let me just go through it, go through the components of it. So let's just focus on this little data table on the right-hand side, right bottom side of the graph. So here, what we're doing is for each of the 3 high electrification scenarios, electrification with fuel backup, electrification with best-in-class technologies, and electrification with legacy technologies, we are reporting the average peak growth rates over our study period, which is 2022 through 2031, under each of the energy efficiency and load flexibility scenarios. So if you focus on the very first column, so these are the expected growth rates if we stick with the existing/mandated DSM programs. And we see that with the fuel backup electrification scenario, year over year peak growth rate is 0.6%. So when we move to the best-in-class technologies, year over year peak demand growth rate is 1.1%. And with the legacy technologies, year over year peak growth rate is 2.1%. So then if you do a lot more DSM, increase in energy efficiency and load flexibility, we can reduce the pace of that growth with, again, additional DSM. The fuel backup scenario has a minus 0.2% growth, which is actually a decline in the peak growth. With the best-in-class technologies, the growth rate is 0.3%, and with the legacy technologies, growth rate is 1.2%. So these are, again, after doing all that modeling, but we have found the expected peak growth rates to be under these highly electrified scenarios. Let's just now look at the gray line that we present on this chart. So this gray line is effectively looking back to 1980s, and for every decade, looking at the average growth rate in that particular decade. So if you look at between 1980 and 1990 in Maryland, the peak grew at an average of 4.9%. And now between 1990 and 2000, the growth rate was 1.2%. Through 2010, the growth rate was 1.6%. After 2010, due to increased efforts around energy efficiency and some of the financial crisis impact, we've seen the decreases in the peak demand growth, and actually peak declined by 0.6%. And more recently, it's been almost flat and slightly decreasing. So what does it tell us? This tells us that Given our modeled peak demand growth rates for Maryland under these highly electrified scenarios, these growth rates are either comparable to some of the growth rates that we have historically observed in Maryland, or they are even lower than some of those growth rates that the Maryland system was able to support. So I think the short way of maybe summarizing this chart is that the sky is not really falling based on this chart, in that, you know, Maryland can move to a highly electrified future in a managed way because it's done it in the past. It's supported growth rates even higher than these that we observe here. Again, at the system level, you know, we've highlighted this at the beginning of the study. We're looking at these growth rates at the Maryland system level. Obviously, there will be load pockets. There will be parts of the grid that are already ahead and seeing a lot of penetration. And, you know, utilities will find these areas with limited hosting capacity, and we'll need to work on mitigating the issues in those areas. But at a system level, the picture that we're seeing is very much manageable, again, based on historical trends that were observed. Let's move on to the next slide. So next slide is, again, just zooming in on those three scenarios with existing DSM and with additional DSM. And again, just same growth rates. Orange line is the fuel backup, which leads to the lowest growth rates, because during those coldest days of the year, we're relying on our fuel systems. And then highly efficient technologies, best in class, leads to this 1.1%. And with legacy technologies still relying on resistance heating as backup, leads to this 2.1% growth rate. And again, if we can do more DSM, more load flexibility, the outcomes would even be more manageable. Next slide, please. So remember that we've done this study actually at the utility level. So we've done all this modeling for each of the in-scope utilities, and we've put everything together to give us a Maryland system view. So in the report, you will see a lot more details on each of the in-scope utilities, but I just want to highlight a few of interesting observations. So if you look at BGE and PEPCO, you will see that their peak demand has decreased quite substantially over the past 2 decades. So even with electrification, so I'm now looking at this projected period, even with the highest electrification scenarios, their peak load is either around their highest peak around 2010, or in PEPCO's case, their highest peak under the highly electrified future is less than their observed peak in 2010. So that means that they must have some headroom in their system to be able to support this increased heating related, mostly electrification, because their system, you know, they're summer peaking systems, and they have sufficient headroom in their systems while heating electrification really grows to be at that level and exceeds it. So that's helpful. And some of these utilities, DPL, SMECO, Potomac Edison, and Choptank, their growth rates have picked up over the past decade. So that means that their starting point is higher than the BGEs and PEPCOs. So when you add more electrification and more load on top of it, they end up at a point where they are about their historical peak. So that in those systems, there's definitely going to be need for, again, building out the systems. And again, both for BG and PEPCO, this doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, they're just going to sit back and relax because they don't have to make any investments. They will need to make investments locally to mitigate those areas that are experiencing the highest growth rates. But at the system level, they have some headroom in their systems because they were summer peaking, and then they're going to be winter peaking at some point during our study period. And BG is around 26, 27. It's going to be switching to a winter peaking system, and PEPCO is a bit later, I think around 28, 29, that they will switch to becoming a winter peaking system. And the Maryland system as a whole, we have projected that it will switch from being summer peaking to winter peaking around 26 and 27. So we will see those changes if the electrification happens in the way that we modeled it. The next slide, please. So just very quickly, we've been looking at the growth in the peak demand, but when we look at the change in annual electricity sales under the existing mandated DSM scenarios, we will see that overall electricity will grow by 0.6% year over year. And under the additional DSM scenario, the overall energy will grow at 0.3% year over year. And in this chart, we are essentially showing each factor and its impact on the energy. And most of the blocks are comparable across these scenarios, but I want to highlight the DSM block. As you can see, we are modeling a lot more DSM under the additional DSM scenario, and that leads to a 0.3 percentage point reduction again in the energy growth rates for Maryland. The next slide, please. So then what does this electrification mean for fuel consumption? So under the reference case, the building sector consumes around 122 million MMBTUs per year. We find that under our electrification scenarios, that's down to 81 to 82 million MMBTUs per year, which represents a 30% reduction in the building sector fossil fuel consumption. The next slide, please. And in terms of the emissions, that 30% reduction in the building sector fossil fuel usage corresponds to a roughly 30 to 31% reductions in emissions, direct GHG emissions from the building heating, again, building sector, which is, again, very comparable to what is modeled under MDE 60/31 study and what would be required for the building sector to achieve for the state to meet its 60/31 goal. So our calculated emissions are very much aligned with what's required to meet that 60/31 goal. The next slide, please. So again, just to recap, we have found that under our high electrification scenarios, Maryland building sector can decarbonize at a pace consistent with meeting the economy-wide goals of 60% GHG reduction by 2031. When this happens, building sector gas consumption is projected to fall by 31 to 32%. Then we looked at the peak demand growth rates, again, year over year. These growth rates are either comparable or they are less than historical growth rates that were observed in Maryland. Maryland electric system is currently summer peaking, but we have modeled it, or we have seen that after this electrification impact, it would switch to winter peaking around 26 to 27. And we have also shown the impact of doubling down on DSM and load flexibility. You know, the peak impacts are already quite manageable under the existing paradigm of energy efficiency and load flexibility. But if you wanted to keep those growth rates even lower, there are ways to do that by doing more of energy efficiency and load flexibility. And as I mentioned, the load declines in the 2010 through 2022 timeframe has essentially left some capacity headroom in the distribution system. So it will be helpful to absorb some of this load growth due to heating electrification before more upgrades will be necessary system-wide. And last but not least, again, we were very careful to highlight this all along, that this study was conducted at the system level. So this is not a substitute for individual utilities, distribution system plans, and they are very granular, locational distribution system planning studies. So those studies will be very necessary and important to just, again, to ensure that the transition to this highly electrified future will be managed properly. So that's really the end of our slides. We're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Commissioner Barbe was going to make any comments or if he's just here to make us see a familiar face.
Well, I'll let me just say this. First of all, it's great to see and work with all of you. Feeling very nostalgic. I think, you know, what I get from all of this is that the climate solution goals are very doable with the electric grid. That was a big question, especially in the mind of the Senate when we were working on this. As Chair Wilson will be able to tell you, and Speaker Pro Tem Dana Stein will be able to tell you, that was something that was very much concern for the Senate. The other thing I think is that I was frankly surprised by the power of demand side management. In other words, the DSMs, the ability to shave load, the ability to manage demand. It's really almost like a superpower, and it's one of the quickest and easiest ways for us to achieve our goals without having to build new transmission or new power plants. And that's really all I want to contribute to at this moment. It really, I have to say, this report basically brought the climate solutions law to life for me, and it was very gratifying to see it as it was being rolled out. And I have to compliment John Burkowski for being able to manage a work group that had 170 participants. I couldn't have done that. So thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. If colleagues want to use the raise hand function, Chair Wilson and I can call on our respective members. Chair Wilson, after you.
Delegate Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the presentation. I got two quick questions. With 170 members, how often did you meet with 170 members? That's a big committee.
Yeah, I'll take this as John Borkowski. The tempo of the work group in the beginning was every 2 weeks, and we started this in August of 2022 because of the fact that you know, the Climate Solutions Act wasn't passed until the 2022 General Assembly. But because we needed to quickly develop an RFP and get that out, really through the end of 2022, we were meeting every 2 weeks. And then in the beginning of 2023, it was pretty much every month. But once we got Brattle selected and engaged, we continued generally once a month, but we had several subgroups that met separately with Brattle, dealing with assumptions. For instance, we had a subgroup on just heat pump assumptions that met a couple of times. We had an EV assumptions. We had a demand side management assumptions subgroup. So there were a number of work group meetings, but there were also a number of subgroup meetings throughout the whole conduct of the study.
Okay, and my final question will be twofold. When I look at surrounding states and I look to where they're trying to get to with this net zero, there isn't a state within 14 years of our dates, of our goals and what have you, based on Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, and what have you. And I'm wondering if we're rushing this. And the other thing that is really difficult for me to really look at this is there are no costs associated with this. And when you're looking at something like this, it kind of rivals some of the things we did with Kerwin. We really want to do a lot of things, but the ratepayers are of huge concern. And when you talk about taking away fossil fuels and making them secondary, all that's going to do is increase the cost of those fuels. And I just wanted to bring that to light. Isn't that so?
Well, if I could respond to that, Delegate, obviously the cost are things that the commission is going to have to factor in as we're moving toward this. We look at the investments offered by the utilities to do increased electrification. But I think Commissioner Barbe can support me on this. The purpose of this study was to really see if the grid itself had the capacity to handle this increased load that we are going to be required by electrification. So it's not saying that cost is irrelevant, but it was really looking at a capacity study as opposed to a cost study. Those decisions are going to be with the commission and with you as we're going forward as to how fast we get to this these goals we want to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And to the Speaker Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great presentation by Brattle, and it's also terrific to see that that the study confirms that, as the Commissioner Barve said, that the electrification sort of vision that's envisioned by the Climate Solutions Now Act can be done on a capacity basis with the current grid and with additional growth to grid capacity. Just have a question concerning the reference to additional mitigation that's available through more energy efficiency and load flexibility measures. Did Brattle quantify the amount of additional cost or programs that would be needed on the energy efficiency or load flexibility to get to that significant mitigation?
Yeah, I can take that question. So we definitely quantified the impact from that significant mitigation, increase in that mitigation, because we presented increases in participation from the customers in those programs, but we've also have estimates for each customer how much of a peak impact that we are expecting, or how much of the load shifting that we are expecting. So by putting the participation assumptions and those impacts together, we are able to estimate the additional mitigation power that we can derive from more DSM or load flexibility. But again, we really haven't engaged in trying to cost this out. All we know is that this was a scenario in utilities and power plants. It was represented as maximum achievable energy efficiency outcomes, at least the energy efficiency piece, so meaning that this is doable. It's just that current funding levels or current mandates are not supportive of doing that at this time. But for load flexibility, Maryland is really still at the beginnings of its journey, and there's a lot more that can be done to do more in the way of managed charging and harnessing the commercial customer or demand response capabilities and things like that. But no cost calculations were done at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Chair. I believe you're
your member, Chair Wilson, Delegate Weibel.
Nope. Well, I'm sorry, Delegate Foley's had her hand up.
Oh, I was just going back and forth between the committees.
Oh, that's no worries. No, Delegate Foley's had her hand up.
Delegate Foley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairs. And thank you very much for this presentation. I am gratified to hear that the grid seems to be able to handle the electrification requirements that we're inclined to put on it in the climate solutions as we march toward the Climate Solutions Now goals. But I do have a question at the risk of opening a can of worms for the PSC about data centers. The governor has come out publicly that he's very much in favor of having data centers come to Maryland. You all are well aware that there's a project underway in Frederick County, possibility of bringing data centers to Frederick County, and everybody knows that they consume large amounts of energy. Just wondering if there was any consideration, like how would that, if we did develop a data center industry here in Maryland, was there any consideration given to maybe the impact that might have on the grid and the capacity of the grid, or any other project or any other initiative like that? Was there any consideration given to that? Thank you.
Well, let me let John talk about that in more detail, but I think given the timing of this study, I don't think the data center issue was really a focus of the demand. Obviously, as you said, they have a significant impact on the grid, and there's been discussion from both PJM and the National Reliability Council about the adequacy of the overall system to accommodate them. But, there will be, as they come online, the utilities will be factoring that into their distribution planning systems and the upgrades that they have to make to the system to accommodate that. But John, do you want to talk whether there was any consideration of data centers within this study?
Yes, thank you for the question, Delegate Foley, and thanks, Chair Hoover. We use the utility 10-year plans as a reference starting point for our loads. So to the extent that utilities in their existing 10-year plans have factored in data center assumptions, they would be built into the reference load. But no, we did not go out and specifically develop any assumptions related to data centers other than what would already have been factored into utility 10-year load plans.
Well, I believe that answers her question. I believe we're now to Delegate Weibel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did have one question about capacity on the system. If you look at your chart on page 19, historical and projected Maryland system peak load. Currently we're at somewhere, looks like around 13,000 megawatts. And then it bumps up high electrification with existing DSM programs. It looks like it's approaching 16,000. So it is a significant increase in the demand. So what is the actual capacity for PJM to meet that increased demand? Did anybody look at that?
Well, I think that the way that Brattle presents this is to say that we have headroom because between 2010 and 2020, the actual peak went down a bit. It's been flat recently. And so we have a bit of headroom as a result of that. And so the way I would interpret it is to say that we have the capacity and we can especially augment it by having more demand side management.
Right. And what I would add to it, Commissioner Barbie, is as part of, again, the planning functions that both utilities and also PJM does. They do look at these forecasts and they build, procure resources to be able to meet the future demand. So these growth rates that we see here have been definitely also supported by PJM in the past. And so again, I even though I haven't looked at, I know that PJM is forecasting a lot more growth, mostly due to data centers in the future, in the near term. So I wouldn't be concerned about PJM's capabilities to meet this load coming through electrification to Maryland. I'm pretty sure they are also accounting for some electrification, although I would say that even though PJM is modeling some electrification, they are not going through this exercise of modeling like highly electrified building sectors. So because these are essentially scenarios in our case, these are not our bet on like what the future is most likely to look like. So I wouldn't expect to find a very comparable scenario in PJM's forecasting materials.
So has PJM seen the study?
We do have PJM reps that are on the task force or the work group. So yes, they've at least seen the study. They have not reacted to it.
All right, so do we expect a comment from them or not, or is it?
Well, I'll put it this way. I would think that if they had any concerns with it, we would have heard something. So given the fact that they have not offered any comment, we have regular communications with them on a wide variety of issues, and no one that I've spoken to at PJM has said a word about any concern related to this study.
All right. And then my last question, it relates to what Delegate Ahrens had brought up. When does someone look at the cost of adoption?
Well, as I said earlier, when we review filings by the utilities, and obviously they have a distribution planning process that we have actually opened up to other stakeholders to participate in. And so we will be reviewing the plans that they put forward as to how they're going to meet the increased demand. And we're the ones that have to decide whether or not ratepayers should fund the investments that they're looking for. And then there will be other issues related to dealing with climate change that the folks at the General Assembly and the governor are going to have to address going forward. But it's a whole sort of team effort to sort of look at how we can do this and keep rates affordable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I just want to commend obviously I haven't read the entire report, but this was focused on capacity, which is the beginning of what we're trying to do. We need to make sure we can even walk down that path, as we, so I really appreciate the report. I think we have next is Delegate Charkoudian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the PSC and Brattle and everyone who worked on this. And it's a very thorough report. I would echo that I think you did what it is that the General Assembly asked you. And I'll just start with a quick comment, which is, and you can respond or if you have thoughts on it. I do think it's really valuable for us to look at between now and 2045, because the kind of investments that need to be made on the grid now really will affect where we are in 2035 and 2040. So I think the sooner we kind of look at the rest of electrification towards 100%, the better we're going to be able to plan for and get policy right for that. And relatedly, I think it will be valuable. And again, this isn't a criticism of the study. This is really just to our colleagues, I think, to do some kind of an optimization problem, because the question about cost and how much we invest in demand response and some of the suggestions that can improve that, the question will be like, what is the optimization between those investments and then the what it would cost to the grid and for the grid upgrades for an increase in peak shaving. So those are sort of two broad thoughts about where we might go that I'd be interested in your thoughts. And then one very specific question, because one piece of that optimization, if you hadn't heard yet, I've got a bill on network geothermal. One very specific piece of how we optimize the way that we electrify is with geothermal. And I appreciate the breaking out of the percentage that's geothermal heat pumps and the percentage that's air source heat pumps, the percentage that's higher efficiency air source heat pumps. And I guess my question about it is, there is a significant amount to sort of reach these peak loads that are the minimal increase in peak load. There is a significant amount that is geothermal. And to get there, we're going to have to get policy right. I'm wondering where the 2% sort of as your current baseline comes from, because MEA did a similar study on geothermal, or another study on geothermal and peak shaving, and they're assuming less than 1%. And so I think I'm particularly interested, as folks know, in where we are and what policies we do to get to the right amount, so that the assumptions that we're looking at in these studies are accurate in terms of their peak shaving. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk about both where that original number of the 2%, I think is what's in there, I don't have it in front of me, comes from. And then, if you have policy assumptions that get us to the 7/15%, or if you're sort of saying that's how we get this relatively low peak impact, and then it's on us to get the policies right to get there.
Yeah, thanks, Delegate. I can take that one. So the current penetration numbers are survey-based. They come from a survey that was done as part of the Empower Energy Efficiency Program proceeding of residential customers. And then that's kind of extrapolated to the whole of Maryland. The assumption for 2031, that was based on kind of an overall assumption of 100% zero emission equipment sales by 2031 in all of the scenarios. And the split up kind of comes from the working group input and our judgment on kind of the technology readiness for each of these technologies, and kind of where we're seeing the trend in terms of how much customers are adopting ground source versus air source and their kind of relative costs. So since ground source technologies are much more expensive today, probably going to be fewer customers adopting them. And there's also more technical kind of feasibility constraints, because you have to drill a whole, boreholes to be able to use them, but they're a lot more efficient. So that was kind of how we came up with the mix of different electric heating technologies. And as you said, there will definitely have to be policies to kind of achieve that level of adoption. So we kind of haven't really speculated here as to what the incentive would have to be or what the policy would have to be, but there is an underlying assumption that there's some kind of policy implemented to make that happen.
And I guess in response to the broader question, I mean, we have we've opened up the distribution planning process that the utilities undertake to figure out how to address these things. And so we're looking for other ideas on that. And I think as going forward, as we have been, we're going to be adapting to the policies enacted by the General Assembly. So the General Assembly has, put forward an idea of increasing the amount of storage. The General Assembly has put forward ideas on increasing the amount of renewables. And so as those policy changes are made at your level, then we will react to that and make changes to the system going forward. So whatever new systems are incentivized or authorized, we'll try to adapt to that changing dynamic.
Well, I don't see any other questions, at least from my committee finally. Delegate Corman? Or Chairman
I do not
Corman?
see any more from the Environment and Transportation Committee, so appreciate everyone's presentations and engagement. Just a reminder, I think for both our committees, Chair Wilson, that we're back together on Zoom at 1:30.
Yes, that's correct. So please be on time, guys, so we can get this started at 1:30.
Great.
Forward to seeing
Thanks,
everybody's
everyone.
smiling faces.
Okay, great to see you all.
Okay, thank you
See
very much.
tomorrow.
Take care.